Hello and welcome back to the conversation here at Breaking the Consensus. I'd like to welcome you all to the conversation. I think it's going to be a good one. Now, before we start, I'd like to draw your attention. Hit the old like button on the page so that we get our likes up. You'll also see at the bottom there, there's a little link you can click on, which gives you an opportunity if you want to support us in our work. These difficult times, it's very hard to keep going. And also, if you want to be made aware of new material, new videos, whatever coming out, if you if you hit on subscribe when you go to the YouTube channel, all that will do. You're not committing to a 12-month subscription, just that you'll be told every time we put a new video that you might be interested in seeing. I'm delighted today to say that we are going to have a chat with one of Ireland's leading literary, cultural, political figures of the last number of years now, Mary Kenny. Mary, welcome and thanks a million for joining the conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, I suppose, Mary, you are one of Ireland's most well-known, famous, infamous feminists. So, what was the world like for for a woman, the world that you were born into? If you could have a sense of what was that Ireland like?
Well, I was born in the 1940s, in 44 actually, and obviously I sort of came to childhood. My memories would just start at the very end of the 1940s when my father would have died. I do remember that. So we're talking about the 1950s, which was a very, very quiet decade, as everybody knows. It's often characterized as very dull and repressive, not just in Ireland, but in many societies. That often comes up in American literature and British literature as well. And I suppose in Ireland it was particularly so. It was still, in many ways, you might say, a Victorian society, because of Ireland had been neutral during the Second World War, and that did mean cutting the country off from a lot of international influences, including, interestingly, influences in the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, I examined this in a book called Goodbye to Catholic Ireland. The Catholic Church up to the 1940s had a very kind of internationalist focus. It always had that dimension of universalism, which was reflected in popular magazines like The Far East or even The Messenger of the Sacred Heart. They were interestingly international. And that was all cut off in 1940 when Ireland was cut off from so much of the world. And there was quite heavy censorship of both state and church after that. And so it was a very old-fashioned, and I think would be characterized as a repressive society. However, things are always much more complex when you look closely at them and when you look at the nuances. And I'm reading a lot around Irish social history at the moment. And some English visitors to Ireland thought it was very liberated in some ways because, for example, there were no gambling laws. The Irish were very liberal and permissive about gambling.
We had bookies.
And the Brits still had that old Methodist restrictions on gambling, and it's interesting how these English visitors noted too that the Catholic Church had no objection to lotteries, and the whole hospital sweepstakes were funded, of course, by lottery. So that was a kind of interesting side bar on going back and reading the material. You always find kind of surprising things as well.
You said it's interesting that the church also was affected by the hiatus of the Second World War. I know from reading, maybe people don't know now, but this first half of the 20th century, the Irish church would be heavily influenced by the French church.
Indeed.
In its theology and its popular devotions.
Sure.
And there would have been I think the church would have had a sense of being part of wider Christendom in Europe, and certainly, I mean, we were sending priests, nuns, and brothers all over the world, vastly disproportionate numbers. And you feel that the Second World War had a real concrete effect on that internationalization, that it was a knockback to
It
our
was
connection.
really, Michael, because of course it was much harder to travel, but also the magazines. I examined the reading matter that was coming into Ireland, and
Mm-hmm.
precisely as you say, there was always a tremendous interest in French Catholicism. I mean, the whole Legion of Mary, Frank Duff, you know, all those people were very influenced by French Catholic intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
really. People like Jacques Maritain were very important. And
Malraux.
you know, and of course, Saint Louis de Montfort and so on. And of course, if you look at, I mean, things like Blackrock College, you know, that was the Holy Ghost Fathers. These were French
French.
orders.
Yes.
My own father studied at Salamanca in Spain. That wasn't at all unusual for people of his generation. But in 1940, everything that came into the state was censored. So I just noticed all those international magazines were no longer available. And so it became a more isolated society. I mean, I do wonder if the coronavirus may have, I won't say a similar effect because we do have more international contacts, but it may have a more insulating effect on some societies. But that's
Yeah.
speculation,
Well,
actually.
I think that a lot of people are wondering that we're already seeing it. Political changes that are beginning, cracks in the old consensus, and that whatever, that not that this will birth something new, but that it may accelerate a process that's already starting. That's a conversation maybe for another day, but I think it's an interesting one. So I just, in your own experience, your father dies when you're very young. I mean, other than the traumatic effect that the loss of a parent for a child, the economic effect at that time, well, any time still. I know my grandmother, who was actually a Victorian, when in the 1880s lost her. Now that was the time when if you lost a parent who was a principal wage earner, you could drop from being very comfortable working class to being destitute, straight down. Now,
Absolutely.
obviously, that wasn't the case when you were there, but it must have had a pretty significant effect on your life.
Absolutely. But of course, children don't sort of appreciate that at the time, you know, in
Hmm.
a sense, children accept whatever is. But you're so right, Michael, that to lose a parent in times gone by before there was a structure of a welfare state was catastrophic, really, absolutely catastrophic. And I suppose we in the feminist movement, you know, when we were young women, we were very scornful of the idea that a woman would say, would perhaps give the breadwinner pride of place at at a family meal. You know, the breadwinner might be
Yes.
fed first. Or I'm not sure fed first, but certainly would have pride of place. And that's not just Irish. I mean, there's a very good book of social history, famous one by Richard Hoggart, called The Uses of Literacy, which is really examining working class life in the 1930s in Leeds in Yorkshire. And he's, you know, the breadwinner was really a very important element in a family life, you know, because as you say, um, you know, poverty beckoned if you lost the breadwinner.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there was such fear over tuberculosis and everything like that.
Yes.
And of course, looking back on my mother was a widow, my siblings were much older. Looking back, I realized we were really very poor, actually, I think. I mean, my mother, as was again often happened in Irish life, was helped by her own family, by her brothers, you know, who had
Right.
steady jobs as doctors and civil servants and things like that. And also, as we know, there was a tremendous emphasis in Irish life on respectability.
Yes.
So, you know, appearances were tried to be kept. You must try and keep up appearances.
That
And
must have
I
been a
suppose
terrible
again, you know, I
stress.
guess looking back, we rebelled against all this. This is bourgeois respectability. It's all hypocrisy and so on. But of course, in later life, you see with a much mellower eye,
Yeah.
and a more forgiving eye to this notion. At the same time, my family they did have this thing, of course, of keeping up appearances,
Yeah.
but at the same time, they also had a kind of bohemian streak as well. And my mother was a kind of romantic who loved sort of the idea of bohemianism in any form of artists and people who were romantic. I mean, she didn't really, for example, she wasn't interested in politics at all, but she came from Galway and she had a great graw for Liam Mellows.
Right.
Now,
Actually, just a local man down down in Galway. We
indeed,
have
that he came from your part of the
we
country.
have a commemoration every
Yeah.
year for
And
Liam Meadows.
yeah, now he's a very interesting character because he's
He is actually,
a
yeah,
very extreme Republican, actually, to
yeah,
be honest, and
yes, and
a very left wing,
politics,
very
yeah,
left wing. I think he believed in the abolition of all private property. So he would have been pretty well what they might have called a Bolshevik, actually.
absolutely, yeah.
But
Not a godless
nevertheless,
Bolshevik, but damn near.
yeah, but nevertheless, a kind of romantic figure.
Yes,
And my mother certainly wouldn't have believed in the abolition of private property, but she nevertheless had that kind of romantic feeling for this man. Of course, he was executed by the Free State in a
yes.
rather brutal episode. So that was the sort of mixed kind of, looking back, I realized I got a lot of mixed messages, really.
But actually, you're in this context. Appearances have to be kept up. You're fortunate in the sense that there's this support system, this familiar support system behind you, that will. So it's not like so you get at least you're offered a good education, whether or not you use it. You end up you go to the Loretto Sisters on the Green. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Now there, it's often said that revolutions don't come from the dispossessed, but the less possessed.
Yes,
And
I think that's the famous French um, observer in America, de Tocqueville. I
yes,
think he said that it's when things are getting a bit better that people have revolutions.
and you're there, you're in the, and I would say, from conversations I had with people, my mother and my aunts, that there were a number of orders, and my own observations here in Galway, because we had a Loretto here in Galway, that there were a number of orders that were really intellectually rigorous, challenging, serious women doing a serious job. The Loretto, the Dominicans, say the Bonsecourt, the
The
Louis nuns, and
Ursulines, I think,
the Ursulines,
very
absolutely,
much
yes.
so. Yeah.
And they were offering a serious academic education to girls, in essentially saying, listen, academically you can do what you want, but in a sense preparing women for positions that didn't exist yet.
I suppose
Well, how did you?
again,
Well, okay. How was your experience of the Loretto?
sort of mixed, because I think that uh, nuns were kind of inspiration, were a kind of mentors of feminism in one sense,
Hmm.
in that, and Simone de Beauvoir, of all people, talks about this, and of course she became a very anti-Catholic and everything, but she did get a very good education from nuns and from the Institut Catholique, where she studied in the 1920s, because the top posh uh, Mandarin schools like the Polytechniques, they didn't accept women in the 1920s in France,
Okay.
but Catholic institutions did. So, she did acknowledge that. She also acknowledged something which I think we might identify with, where she says, it gave me the idea that there's such a thing as a vocation. There's such a thing as a calling. And of course, I think that's very true, that these nuns were dedicated to the education of young women and to their own calling as well. And so I think in terms of an example which was outside of more conventional life. I mean, you often see in American feminism often, which influenced us, of course, often says, well, women were just told to get married and have children. Well,
Yes.
actually, nuns never told you anything like that. They would sometimes say something like, you are the mothers of tomorrow, but they were consecrated virgins. They were not mentoring us for marriage at all.
I think that's an interesting point, particularly for people, say, from culture which is predominantly Protestant. That one of the strange things that Luther is this rejection of the idea of a sacred life for women at all. But it's such a prominent factor in a Catholic society. Andrea Dworkin, who is pretty extreme as they come, but in her one of her seminal works, Intercourse, talks about the role of nuns, the subversiveness of a group of women living by themselves, independent of the control of men, out of marriage, away from the concept of property. For her, Joan of Arc also is one of the great heroes, the virginal hero. So they are, in a sense, figures that to us growing up in Catholic Ireland are the most conventional possible figures, in a sense, are also these, in a broader sense, quite subversive.
Absolutely.
And of course, they're also human beings, and they're going to be mixed bags. They're going to be some will be nice, and some will be nasty. How did you find that?
Well, you know, I think, Michael, the interesting thing is that all that you say is true, and also I look back on the notion of, you know, female saints, for example. Now again, feminism holds that there are women's voices in history are silenced, but actually there were a lot of female saints, and that sort of comes through as well, not just Catherine of Siena, for example, Saint Bridget of Sweden, who's a very remarkable and interesting and very forceful character from the 14th century, and Angela de Medici, who founded the Ursuline order. And you have a lot of women, even
Teresa of Avila, famous, one of the great figures.
Yes, of course. And so you have a lot of women who were had this calling and so on. However, in real life, everything is much more mixed up. And first of all, the nuns themselves, I now realize, this was before Vatican II, they themselves were living under a 17th century rule. And although they were very capable women, we know nuns, you know, were, I mean, going back to the Middle Ages, they were great abbesses, they ran great estates and everything like that. But they were subject to restrictions which were really ridiculous for them. You know, they couldn't go to the dentist without being accompanied by a girl from the 6th class, you know, a senior pupil. So they were not allowed to go to the dentist. And, you know, you do have this sort of, it's true, there was a sort of patriarchal control. I mean, Sister Benvenuto, Margaret McCurtain, a very, very distinguished historian, is also a feminist. She's now in her 90s. She's a remarkable woman, Dominican nun. John Charles McQuaid, she went to University College Dublin in the 50s. John Charles McQuaid, the Archbishop, asked for her notes. He wanted to examine her notes to see you know, what she was writing down in her college notebooks. Luckily, she had quite a feisty Reverend Mother who refused to give John Charles McQuaid Benvenuto's notes and said, "I'm sorry, I answer to Rome, I don't answer to you."
He would not have liked that.
You know, I mean, you know, sometimes you have cases of men being quite afraid of nuns. You know, you have...
There's that figure, it's a little bit like the matron, matron in the hospital. There's also the Mother Superior. I mean, they were substantial women.
They were. Now, the actual school, the teaching itself, also, it was old-fashioned, Michael. It this was before the reforms of 67 came in. It really, the curriculum, the form of teaching, it really was on its... You know, it was a very old-fashioned way of teaching, and it needed really a lot of revision. I mean, our English classes, for example, consisted of learning an essay by Hilaire Belloc, Off by Heart. Well, Hilaire Belloc is quite an interesting stylist, but you know, that's not enough to teach English composition.
No,
You
no.
know.
It didn't, but certainly this way, it didn't engage you. It didn't excite and
Well,
enthuse
I
you,
was a bold girl.
ultimately.
I was a bold girl anyway, so I
And
was. I know I was. I would have been very difficult to control, very difficult to control. But I think the interesting thing. I mean, I'm still in touch with with girls I've been to school with. I say
mhm,
girls, so we still call ourselves girls. But and one of the things we agree on was actually the nuns. Again, maybe it's a question of vocation. They were more committed than the lay teachers. The lay teachers,
mhm,
they're, bless them, they've all departed this world now, but they weren't up to much, actually, to be honest, the lay teachers
mm,
in that school. And I think, again, maybe, you know, maybe education needed to be a little bit more rigorously examined, really, and whether a teacher was really up to it. And some people, and some women, I think, drifted into teaching because they weren't sure what else they would do. So not all the teachers were good,
mm,
and I think the nuns probably should have been a little bit more rigorous in
mhm.
the teachers they appointed. So that's a critique we would all have had. But that's going back. Look, it's going back 50 or 60
Anyway,
years.
you
Yeah.
leave you
So
leave
that's
school at you're 16, and
16.
obviously the question is, what did Katie do next?
Well, the
And
answer,
you don't have a leaving cert. You're not going to go to
no,
college.
no,
Your mother is presumably going, what the hell are we going to do with Mary?
yes.
Or what's Mary going to do with Mary?
Well,
What did Mary think?
I was sent off to a I was sent off to Ross's College on was it around somewhere around I think it was in Stephen's Green. It was in that area in Dublin too, anyway, where I was taught to learn shorthand and typing and get myself a good-looking job. I worked as a waitress for a while in a lovely restaurant called the Country Shop, which was again on Stephen's Green and had a long tradition of kind of organic food and things like that. And Mary Lavin, the writer, whose
Mm.
children were also at Stephen's Green, used to come in there, and she was a great inspiration. She was a wonderful woman.
Short story writer.
Short story writer, yeah.
Wonderful
Very,
short stories.
very, very wonderful short stories. Very, very well observed about Irish life, you
Mhm.
know. Um,
Cruelty, dark side. Anyway,
well, a little bit, but
I
all,
mean, I don't mean herself
no,
personally, I mean
no,
her
no,
stories.
no.
But I think very often short stories, if you think of a whale on Flaherty, there's often an odd cruelty to the short story.
Yes,
Tacky.
perhaps.
For
Oh, McGahern, of
oh
course.
God, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But you're becoming a woman. Is it at this time that your first conscious that you could look back and say this is the time you're starting to become consciously aware of the things that would make you call yourself a feminist? Is this when your consciousness was raised?
Well, I suppose I was always I mean, I was always rebellious, you know. But bear in mind the time I was, timing is everything, as we know. So
Mm-hmm.
my coming of age era coincided with the early 1960s. Now, then, you know, again, all the social histories tell us that the world began to change. Some people say 1963, which I think that was when the first Beatles album came out.
And
Um,
Kennedy is shot.
and Kennedy is shot, of course. And I do think, you know, I was just thinking that this was a definite moment of, you know, of change, really, and of disillusionment and all sorts of things. But of course, but I did go off to Paris in 1962 because I wanted to learn more French, and I thought, you know, if I spoke French, I'd get on better in the world and all that sort of
Right?
thing. So I did go as an au pair girl to France, and of course France between 1962 and 1964, this was the era of protest. You know, the Algerian War was the
Yeah.
focus, very much of protest. So there was a tremendous sense of, you know, I mean, the French always love to take to the streets anyway. You know,
Yeah.
they'll find any excuse. And so, so there were lots and lots of protests going on. De Gaulle was in power, and you know, he was thought to be very authoritarian, and you know how things change in the long view of history, de Gaulle was, you know, the man who saved France during the Second World
Yeah.
War. But by the time he was old, he was regarded as, you know, old-fashioned, and Yvonne, his wife, was particularly, she was quite a sort of stern character as well. And that, so there was a kind of feeling of rebellion against the oldies, you know.
Yeah.
And I suppose I picked up very much on that.
Were you aware of the intellectual tradition around you? I mean, Beauvoir, Sartre, that whole
Yes, I
movement.
became aware, Michael. I mean, I was very undereducated after all, you know. So, I mean, it
And
was.
therefore susceptible, possibly, to wicked men like Jean-Paul Sartre.
I'd like to have met him, but I did, you know, when I was in Paris, I was, you know, used to hang around bars, of course, quite quickly with other, you know, bold young women that I knew. But I did meet a very helpful Irish group of friends, particularly Peter Lennon, who was writing for The Guardian, and also Joe Carroll, who was writing for the Irish papers, and is still, thank heaven, Joe and Kathy Carroll are still very good friends of mine. They're my age. But Peter Lennon was also great friends with Sam Beckett. Uh,
Ah,
you know, and they used to drink together in a pub in Montparnasse called the Falstaff, you know. And all they talked about apparently was cricket.
not rugby. And I thought he was a rugby
Yes.
man, Beckett.
Well, maybe, but Beckett was big on cricket.
I love cricket.
Yeah.
It must have been still an incredible cultural clash to go from Dublin in the, shall we say, in the mindset of the late 50s still, and you arrive in Paris at the time of the Great Unrest, leaving, which eventually going to explode in '68. Did it seem like a different world to you,
Yeah.
or did it just seem like a continuation?
Yes, it was a very different world, because what actually struck me, again, this is a paradox. What was very striking about France and French life was how formal and rigid it was, actually. That was the
Mm-hmm.
interesting thing. Although Ireland is characterized as this repressive society, everyday life in Ireland had a certain laid back quality. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, in our home in Sandymount, people just drifted, came in the door, you know, they just lifted the latch and visited, you
Yeah.
know, and whoever was around got an evening meal or whatever it was. Life was very relaxed, you know. And as a teenager, I wandered all over Dublin at all times of the day and night without anybody ever troubling me or anything. I was bicycling. If I was mad about the theatre, I'd go to the theatre, go to the Gate Theatre and walk home at, you know, 11
Yeah.
o'clock at night. And, you know, it never occurred to me. But when I was in France, everything was organized. Everything was done according to a schedule. Nobody visited except by a specific invitation. There was a real formality to French family life, you know, and this formule de politesse, which they insisted on. And meals were very formal and very carefully planned. And of course, the woman of the house where I worked as an au pair, she was terrified I'd be raped, and she had this obsession.
Oh
And
God.
I'd never heard the word in English. That was the interesting thing. Nobody ever mentioned. I mean, obviously, I kind of knew that such things happened, but she kept saying, "Mademoiselle, vous serez violée, vous serez violée." Oh my God, she was terrified if I walked alone at night. So that was an interesting thing, that although France was sort of intellectually very free, nevertheless, in everyday small things, it was actually very unfree in a way.
You, she was terrified that you would be violet.
Yeah.
Did this fear communicate itself to you? Did you
Well,
become frightened?
I did actually start to get nervous, you know, which I hadn't been kind of before. The, you know, there was also, I have to say, probably a little element of racism in this thing. They were always talking about les Arabes, you know, they had this thing about Arabs because of the Algerian thing. And they were kind of, so looking back, I can see that was an underlying element. Um, and probably completely unfair and untrue. But I suppose it made me aware that I wasn't in safe old Dublin anymore.
Yeah. Do you think at this stage, whether just by the water you're swimming in culturally or what you're reading or the people you're talking to, does the way you look at the world politically, analytically change in France or as a result of the time you spend in France? Or is it more just a kind of a general human cultural growth?
Well, I suppose we bring all our experiences, to our view of the world and of our view of ourselves. And yes, and anything that happens to you between the ages of 18 and 20, are very, leave a very strong impression. Very, very strong. I mean, during a summertime, I went down to the Pyrenees area where I was asked to spend a month with a group of nuns in not far from Lourdes, actually, in a in the near Po, and these were French nuns, but they just wanted an English-speaking person to join them for a month to speak English to them, and it was the usual arrangement. They gave you your board and your meals and some pocket money for the locality, and of course that was an interesting thing, because these nuns were freer. I have to say, well, this was the countryside, so it wasn't Paris, and they were mostly local women, but they had their already, of course, the habits had changed. So the habits were much lighter than the nuns in Ireland. And also the way they drank wine at lunch, they swigged back this wine, and that really, and it was just the normal, the normal wine of the countryside.
It's funny, an aunt of mine went to boarding school in Cork, I think, with the Louis nuns, and they just come in, and they used to have cider with their lunch when she went there. And I was talking to a nun afterwards, who transpired, would have crossed over, a very elderly lady with my aunt, and she said, "Oh, that only lasted another 2 years." The uproar from the parents when they discovered that their girls were drinking cider. Oh my! It's funny, isn't it, for a nation which has this thing, and yet, if in its church, like in Maynooth, you could get away with a warning for a lot of stuff, but you were found with drink in your room, you were out.
I see, yes.
Drunkenness, and in fact, students were banned from drinking within 3 miles of the college, which I think it's something to do with the fact that there had been rather too many fights in the 19th century, riots and stuff. But we have this odd relationship with alcohol, what shall we say?
Yes.
I think actually probably more normal now than we've ever had it, but historically that's right. So these nuns were drinking wine, they were going. It was a different, less formal, less stiff kind of experience.
Well, it was the country. It was very much reflected country life, really.
Yeah, and you're down south as well, of course.
Yeah,
which is...
yeah, of course, absolutely. So that was different from Paris, and so that was another interesting experience. And there were nuns there. They were from the Vincent de Paul, because they had these wonderful butterfly wimples, if you remember, which I think.
Oh, I've seen them. I've seen them in photographs, to be honest.
There's a wonderful artist called Muriel Brandt, who's depicted these nuns in 1916 in the streets of Dublin. The pictures are at the Crawford Gallery in Cork, and where they went out to feed the children and everything. But some of these nuns had come back from the Congo.
Seen some bad things.
Again, they were actually rather spirited, and they talked about, their friendship with converted cannibals and things like that. So there was also that notion that the mission field was exciting. It was exciting.
Was there ever a glimmer at the back of your mind, the Black Dahlia, after seeing some very glamorous nuns in cinema, that maybe you find yourself out in the Belgian Congo treating them, and with some handsome French doctor beside you? The notion of being, did you ever even briefly consider the idea of a religious life?
I would have been far too kind of wild and probably, I think the notion of celibacy would have been very
That was
of
a
course,
deal breaker, shall we say.
I would say. But I remember as schoolgirls, we were very entranced by a movie called The Nun's Story, which
Yeah,
with Audrey Hepburn and Peter Finch,
yes, I've
and
seen it.
of course, that was very piquant. I'm kind of sorry now to see the nuns in general get a terribly bad rap
Mm.
in Ireland today, um, over these orphanage stories, and I think we need to do an awful lot more research into how these things happened, how,
Yeah, and I think
how,
people need to be rigorous and historical about it. And frankly, they have to read the books, not watch a movie.
yes,
And
yes,
I remember after and people have to understand that to make distinctions. That the nun, whatever, I think it's a tragedy what happened to the Christian Brothers. An incredible tradition, incredible gift, and what happened in places like Letterfrack was just awful. The Magdalene Lounges is a different story. It's not a nice story. It's not a pleasant story. A lot of that unpleasantness, I think, is about Irish society as it was as much about the religious orders.
yes.
And I read, for my pleasure, I read the report, the MacAleese report. Now, whether that's a complete report or that's another thing that time will deal with that. And I remember having discussions with people, and they'd seen the movie, and I'd read the report, and they weren't interested in the report.
Mm.
If you said, well, actually, that didn't happen, that wasn't reported as happening.
What
But that's
movie
going to take time as well for
was this
us
the
as a
movie of?
people to become distant.
Sorry, Michael. Was that the movie of the Magdalene Sisters? Is that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
There was
yeah.
a movie about the
Well, a
laundries.
movie is a movie, and you know,
It was
the whole
fiction,
thing
to be
about
honest.
any dramatic construction is that you must have baddies and goodies, and you
Yeah.
must dramatize everything,
Mm.
and so therefore that's not the same at all as a proper historical, research. But I do to some. I mean, I want to learn a great deal more about this, but I do think that some blame must also be attributed to this obsession with respectability
Hmm.
in Irish society.
Yeah.
Went very, very deep, and so many of the young unwed mothers, for example, who ended up or were admitted to mother and baby homes, were consigned there by their own families.
Oh,
And that's something we don't like to think about, because I think we have this idea that a family would never do this, but unfortunately, families would and did.
oh, the history of the family in Ireland is, the mother and baby homes full of their children, and these girls were mostly children. Our asylums were very often places where somebody who maybe was going to get another part of the farm, or somebody who was a bit of a trouble, or an older relative we wanted, and with the complicity very often of maybe of a GP, these people were deposited there, and there was nothing actually wrong with them. They had no psychiatric condition. There's a dark history about what families will do in Ireland, and
Yeah.
it's not exclusive to Ireland, I'm sure.
No, indeed.
But
My uncle was a psychiatrist actually at Limerick Asylum back in the 50s. And there were, I mean, I know from my conversations with him subsequent, I mean, there were quite a few people consigned to the asylum who they actually had nowhere else to go sometimes. It was such a complicated story. There were more than, somewhat more considerable number of people, men particularly, who had been affected by poaching drinking,
mhm.
things like that, which can actually give you a sort of, it can actually kind of do
Cause
some
brain
horrible
damage,
brain
ultimately.
damage.
It's a form of
And
brain
they
damage. Yeah.
had, gone on rampages and so on. So I think and families didn't know what to do with them, and they did consign them. Yeah.
So, will you come back from France, or do you come back to Ireland now, or where do you go after France?
Well, I was on my way back to Ireland, but I stopped off in London, and my elder sister had shared a flat in Kensington with 4 or 5 air stewardesses. So I rang one of them up and I said, could I stay overnight? And she said, yeah, sure. So I sort of started to, I joined this group of BOA stewardesses who, BOAC, who had this wild flat in Kensington Church Street. And so...
At a time when that was a much more glamorous job than it is perhaps today.
Very, very much so. And the reason why you could have 4 or 5 girls in a flat was that they had very long stayovers in those days. So if they were going to Australia, they would stay in Australia for maybe another week or something,
Right.
stopovers, and so on. And so it was absolutely very, very glamorous and amusing. And one or two of them I'm still in touch with, and they were very, very interesting young women,
So was London swinging? Had it started to swing?
We're coming to 1964 now, so yeah, I suppose it was exciting. Yeah, it was exciting. And I saw somehow one way or another, somehow wormed my way into journalism. But I had a lot of different jobs in the meantime, Michael. Like everybody, in those days, there was, I guess, full employment, and it was very easy to get a job. It was also easy to get fired from jobs. So, you went from...
Okay. Time is pressing on. So before we finish up today, because I think we'll come back to this another time, hopefully, if you're willing.
That'd be lovely.
I'd like to say, just get a sense, we're now in the mid-60s, we're heading to middle of the 60s. What are the things that are beginning for you to be real concerns? What are the things that are making you angry? What are those things that you see around you that make you angry, that a sense of injustice that drives you towards what would be your political activity or political position?
Well, Michael, I don't think I was a particularly noble young woman at all. I was actually basically, I loved all the excitement of things. I loved the excitement of going out on anti-Vietnam demos. Well, of course, everybody thought the war in Vietnam was dreadful. And I suppose that was a significant thing, because I suppose it was the first war that we were seeing on our television screens. It brought it real home. I mean, can you imagine if the First World War had been photographed in the trenches? Can you imagine how that would have been? So I suppose that was going on. I did actually get a job then in the mid-60s in the Evening Standard, and I was very lucky.
The Evening Standard, for those people, it's essentially a newspaper. It's a London newspaper.
It's very much a London newspaper.
Almost the London newspaper. You get it on the way home on the tube. Once upon a time.
Yeah, it was very esteemed, really, at the time. But anyway, looking back, there's a lot of social history now saying the whole culture changed in the middle 1960s. Some people put it at 1967, 1968. They're the key things, where you had sort of television programs which were satirical, which were making fun all the time of the toffs and the people who were in charge, and of the church. That was another great thing. And of course, meanwhile, in the Catholic Church itself, there were all these things going on. You had Vatican II in 1962-63, which was really important, actually, and was a form of liberation for many people, and a form of optimism, and an overdue form of reforms, of course, in many ways.
You talked about, because it's interesting. You talked about satire and things, and I think that for some viewers it's been interesting. This is the period of satire, and Peter Cook and the Club, and that was the week that was, and all that. It was, they at one stage, as part of the show, I don't know, was it Cook or one of the, did an impersonation of Macmillan.
Yes.
And this was regarded as scandalous. And I think I'm interrupting you to say this, because I think that for a modern audience today, it's really hard to imagine that. But it was genuinely, it was a success to scandal that they were imitating the Prime
Yes,
Minister.
yes, yeah.
And that is just the sense of distance, the way the culture has moved, that now, in a sense, politicians can't demand respect. They have to dig for it if they're going out again.
Yes.
Respect is almost discounted. You mentioned Vatican II. Were you aware of that at all personally, or was that something just happening initially?
I suppose it was, I mean, funnily enough, I was more aware of it in France, really, when it started, because they also had in France these movements like worker priests, you know,
Yeah.
it was left-wing Catholic movement. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of the family that I was with. They were Catholics, although they were different, perhaps a little bit more in the Latin style, you know, where there was the women and children who were expected to go to mass, whereas the fathers didn't so much. You know, that was sort of an old French and Italian tradition. But so I was aware of that changes, and you couldn't but be aware of the changes with Vatican II, and it was regarded. And I think afterwards I examined a lot of the literature, and it did make a huge impact. I mean, it made a very big impact in Ireland in one terribly nice way, which was that Irish people felt they could be much more neighbourly with Protestant neighbours. You know,
Right.
that was a big thing in Ireland. They had felt inhibited before.
Well, you needed special permission of the bishop to go to a Protestant
That
church.
sort of thing.
So
And
if you had a neighbour who died or a funeral, you couldn't go.
sure, there was that, and I think, you know, Irish people have such a tradition of cordiality and neighbourliness, and I think that was, they were really, really pleased. And John Horgan, who wrote a lot about Vatican II in the Irish Times, and he had a very witty phrase, a witty description of. You know, some part of the west of Ireland, probably Clare, really, I imagine, West Clare, where they were now worried there mightn't be enough Protestants to go round, you know, 'cause everybody wanted to be, you know, and it was really rather nice kind of
I
Irish.
remember, I probably shouldn't say it, was many moons ago, my mother's people from Clare, and a cousin was visiting. They're from southwest Clare, little village down there, and where we are, we have a long tradition. We've a very significant Anglican population in North Wexford, South Wicklow, has been for many hundreds of years, and lots of businesses and tradesmen, and it's very proletarian in comparison to most of the rest. So blocklayers and tilers and plasterers and plumbers and mechanics, you know, it's a mix. Just everybody sort of gets on as well. 98 has been forgotten. Anyway, it was the feast of Conversion of St. Paul, which is the week around which the week of the ecumenical activities happens. And Bridie was visiting during that week, and my mother said to her, "I suppose, Bridie, no more than in your parish, because we're having a prayer service in the Methodist church, and then Christ Church was having something else, and St. Michael's chapel was having something, and there were all these things and lectures, and it was all great busyness and lovely." And she said to me, "Well, we will be doing, I suppose, the same thing in your parish at home, Bridie." And Bridie's response, "Well, Teddy, we would, if we had anyone to be ecumenical with."
That's nice.
And she said, "Well, I remember my mother talking that there was a family two parishes across, but I think they're gone. So they had no one to be ecumenical with."
That's sweet. And of course,
Anyway,
you know, that in the Irish, in the devotional literature, there was a great reassessment of people like Martin Luther, you know, and they were looking at Martin Luther again. So that was kind of very interesting.
it is
I could see that,
recently.
but I suppose you know, I wouldn't have been deeply into that as a young woman. But I think the next big thing, really, Michael, was Humanae Vitae in 1968. When I mean, there was huge publicity about this, enormous. It was huge.
And there had been an expectation that there would be a relaxation.
Yes, about
And I think, was that where the problem lay? That the expectations had been built, and then they were just completely, I mean, it's unequivocal no.
Yes. Well, I suppose, yes, the was. I imagine that was, and there was a groundswell, really. And of course, the pill had been launched in 1961, you see. and that also changed. That changed the picture a lot because, without getting kind of too into detail, what the original theology, if you like, of being against birth control was not just about go forth and multiply, but it was also about the idea of putting a barrier between a man and his wife, as it
Hmm.
were. And interestingly, I actually learned about this from a Jewish rabbi who explained that in Orthodox Judaism, the same idea prevails, that you are two in one flesh. And so therefore, so the pill kind of changed this in terms of the practicalities, because it was a medication. It was
Yes.
a medication that that a person could, a woman took privately. It had nothing to do with the Marriage Act, actually, as it were. So that was, I think, the reason why there was such high expectation that the ruling would change, because it was, and you could introduce the idea this was a health thing for mothers and women and so on. And of course, Paul did get some considerable advice
Hmm.
to go with that, didn't he? You know,
Oh,
to
yeah. Most of the experts
yes,
uh, before were advising him for a liberalization, if you want to call it that. And it ultimately seems to be Paul's personal decision
yes,
primarily.
yes,
And I think that date is certainly in Ireland and for Catholics is one of those pivotal. It is a pivotal
absolutely.
date.
Pivotal date.
So what I'm going to say is, going to thank you because we're now on the dot. We're on the dot. Thank you for joining us. I'd say I'd hope that maybe sometime soon we can come back and we can move forward. But it's been fascinating listening to you, as it always is. And by the way, you mentioned a book that you wrote, which was Goodbye to Catholic Ireland. And
Yes,
I'd like, now, Mary writes beautifully, and I'd recommend anything that you can get on. But that particular book, I think, is really interesting and has a lot of insights, and I would highly recommend anybody out there
thank
would
you,
like to read it.
thank you very much.
Before we go, I'd also just like to remind you, click on the old like button and click on the link. Now, on the YouTube there, you can click on subscribe, and that will mean you'll know when Mary's on next, and myself too, all that's less important. But also, if you can in these difficult times, it's help us in the work that we do and support. Uh, if you click on the link, that will give the opportunity to do so, and we'd like to thank you and all those who already have done so. Very much for doing that. But for today, it's Michael Dwyer saying thank you again to Mary Kenny, who I hope to see again soon. And thank you to you all, and have a good and a safe week.